Trump voters. 2 years in, here's an updated list of Trump's 30 biggest broken promises. Number 1, he told you he'd cut your taxes and that the super rich like him would pay more.
I think there's very little benefit for people of wealth.
You bought it. But his 2017 tax law has done the opposite. By 2027, according to the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, the richest 1% will have received 83% of the tax cut, and the richest 1/10 of 1%, 60% of it. But more than half of all Americans, 53%, will pay more in taxes. As Trump told his wealthy friends at Mar-a-Lago just days after the tax bill became law, you all just got a lot richer. Number 2, he promised that the average family would see a $4,000 pay raise because of the tax law. You bought it. But real wages for most Americans are lower today than they were before the tax law went into effect. Number 3, he promised to close
special interest loopholes that have been so good for Wall Street investors, but unfair to American workers.
Especially the notorious carried interest loophole for private equity, hedge fund, and real estate partners. You bought it. But the new tax law kept the carried interest loophole. Number 4, he promised to bring an end to Kim Jong-un's nuclear program. You bought it. Kim Jong-un hasn't denuclearized. Number 5, he told you he'd repeal Obamacare and replace it with something beautiful, including insurance for everybody. You bought it. But he didn't repeal and he didn't replace, which is just as well. His plan would have knocked at least 24 million Americans off health insurance, including many of you. Instead, he's doing what he can to cut it back and replace it with nothing. According to the Commonwealth Fund, about 4 million Americans have lost health insurance in the last 2 years. Number 6, he told you,
I'm not going to cut Social Security like every other Republican, and I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid.
You bought it. But now he's planning such cuts in order to deal with the ballooning deficit created in part by the new tax law for corporations and the rich. Number 7, he promised to protect anyone with pre-existing conditions. You bought it. But in June, his Justice Department told a federal court it would no longer defend provisions of Obamacare that protect patients with pre-existing conditions. Attorney General Jeff Sessions said the decision was made with Trump's approval. Number 8, he said he'd build a wall across the southern border. You believed him, but there's no wall. Number 9, he told you he'd invest $1 trillion in our nation's crumbling infrastructure. You bought it. But after his giant tax cut for corporations and millionaires, there's no money left for infrastructure. Number 10, he said he'd drain the Washington swamp.
We are going to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
You bought it. But he's brought into his administration more billionaires, CEOs, and Wall Street moguls than in any administration in history to make laws that will enrich their businesses, and he's filled departments and agencies with former lobbyists, lawyers, and consultants who are crafting new policies for the same industries they recently worked for. Number 11, he promised to reinstitute a 5-year ban on all executive branch officials lobbying the government after they leave government. You bought it. But the 5-year ban he signed applies only to lobbying one's former agency, not the government as a whole, and it doesn't stop former officials from becoming lobbyists. Number 12, he said he'd use his business experience to whip the White House into shape. You bought it. But he's created the most dysfunctional, backstabbing White House in modern history and has already fired and replaced so many assistants that people there barely know who's in charge of what. Number 13, he told you he'd bring down drug prices by negotiating like crazy with drug companies.
We are going to get drug prices, prescription drug prices, way down.
You bought it. He hasn't. Number 14, he told you he'd stop foreign lobbyists from raising money for American elections. You bought it, but foreign lobbyists are still raising money for American elections. Number 15, he promised 6 weeks of paid maternity leave to any mother with a newborn child whose employer does not provide the benefit.
we can provide 6 weeks of paid maternity leave to any mother with a newborn child whose employer does not provide the benefit.
You bought it. But the giant tax cut for corporations and the rich doesn't leave any money for this. Number 16, he said he'd create tax-free dependent care savings accounts for younger and elderly dependents and have the government match contributions low-income families put into their savings accounts. You bought it. He's done neither. Number 17, he said that on day one, he'd labeled China a currency manipulator.
We are going to label China a currency manipulator.
You bought it. But then he declared China is not a currency manipulator. Number 18, he said he won't bomb Syria. You bought it. Then he bombed Syria. Number 19, after pulling out of the Paris Accord, he said he'd negotiate a better deal on the environment. You bought it. There have been no negotiations. Number 20, he promised that the many women who accused him of sexual misconduct will, in his words, be sued after the election is over.
All of these liars will be sued after the election is over.
You bought it. He hasn't sued them, presumably because he doesn't want the truth to come out. Number 21, he said he would not be a president who took vacations and criticized Barack Obama for taking too many.
I promise you, I will not be taking very long vacations if I take them at all. There's no time for vacation.
You bought it. Since becoming president, he spent a quarter of his days at one of his golf properties. Number 22, Trump vowed to push colleges to cut the skyrocketing costs of tuition. You believed him, but he hasn't. Instead, he's made it easier for for-profit colleges to defraud students. Number 23, he said he'd force companies to keep jobs in America and that there would be consequences for companies that ship jobs abroad, especially government contractors.
Companies are not going to leave the United States anymore without consequences.
You believed him. But never before in U.S. history have federal contractors sent so many jobs overseas. There have been no consequences. Number 24, he promised to end DACA. You bought it. And then in January 2018, he promised that DACA recipients should not be concerned. We're going to solve the problem, he said. And then he reversed himself again and vowed to end the program by March 2018. Currently, the federal courts have stayed any action on it. Number 25, he promised to revive the struggling coal industry and bring back lost coal mining jobs. You bought it. But coal is still losing customers as utilities turn to natural gas and renewable power. Number 26, he promised to protect American steel jobs.
We will put new American steel into the spine of our country.
You bought it. His tariffs on steel have protected some steel jobs, but industries that use steel, like automakers and construction, now have to pay more for the steel they use, with the result that their jobs are threatened. The trade partnership projects that 400,000 jobs will be lost among steel and aluminum users. Number 27, he said he'd make America safer. You believed him. But mass shootings keep rising, and Trump has failed to pass effective gun control legislation. After 17 died in Parkland, Florida, he promised immediate action on gun safety in schools, but has done nothing. 28, he promised to make 2- and 4-year colleges more affordable. You bought it. But Trump's most recent budget contains deep cuts in aid for low-income and first-generation college students, reduces federal work-study, and eliminates the 50-year-old Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant Program, which goes to more than 1 million poor college kids each year. Number 29, he promised to eliminate the federal deficit and bring down the debt. You bought it. Yet, due to his massive tax cut, mostly for corporations and the rich, and his military spending, the deficit is set to rise to $1 trillion, and the debt has ballooned to more than $21 trillion. Number 30, he said he'd release his taxes.
I'm under a routine audit, and it'll be released. And as soon as the audit's finished, it'll be released.
You bought it. He still hasn't released his taxes. If you found our video informative, please follow this page.